Description: Ywain, a knight bored with his administrative duties, abandons his estate to his younger brother and goes on a pilgrimage to seek his heart's desire. Following a will-o'-the-wisp resembling a child, his quest takes him to the city of Paladore, where he meets the Lady Aithne, half-fae enchantress. Sir Henry Newbolt's allegorical fantasy was published in hardback in Britain in 1914 and in the United States a year later. It was revived in 1975 as the 5th volume in the celebrated Newcastle Forgotten Fantasy Library. Enjoy listening to the audiobook.
Part 11 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 31 to 33. Chapter 31. How Ywain met with the shepherdess and heard a music, and how he had sight of Aladore the first time. Thus began Ywain to be consorted with fauns, and to live after their manner. And he slept with them that night in a little wildwood, fast by a river. And before they slept they gave him to eat of such things as they had, and truly his supper was no feast, for the fauns live all by nuts and by grains, and have no bread. Also they will taste flesh, but they know not the use of fire. So on the morrow early they caught a good fish and tore it, and when they perceived that Ywain loved not raw meat, then they had pity on him, and they left the river, and brought him to a shepherd's hut, and they made him understand that he should go nearer and knock upon the door, for they knew that where there were men there belike would be men's meat, whether of bread or of flesh. So Ywain came to the hut and knocked upon the door, but he heard no voice within. And when he would have knocked again a second time, he dared not, for he knew that there stood one within, and listened silently. Then he devised to speak instead of to knock, and he spoke the greeting of a pilgrim, humbly. And while he was yet speaking, the door was opened, and there was a young shepherdess standing upon the threshold. And when he saw her, his heart began to beat furiously, and the beating of it upon his ribs was like the galloping of a horse upon a green road. For the shepherdess stood looking at him out of youth and fearfulness, but the face was the face of his lady, and of no woman else. Then his voice changed, and he spoke again to her trembling, but she nodded with her head, and answered not. And she put forth her hand to bring him in, and he perceived that it was brown and hard. And he looked again, and saw how her face also was brown, as with the burning of one summer upon another. Then he said within himself, My lady was never so, yet if this be not her body, it is her soul, and in all her shapes I am to serve and follow her. Then the shepherdess gave him to eat, and that which she gave him was no rich man's portion. But without doubt she changed it in the giving, for the bread was fine bread between his teeth, and the flesh was as the flesh of swans and peacocks. And while he ate, she looked upon him, and he also looked upon her, and he ate but little by reason of his looking and his delight. And when she perceived this, she forsook him suddenly and went out, and immediately his hunger increased upon him, and he dealt shortly with all that she had given him. Then she came again suddenly, and looked upon the bare board, and laughed, but in all this time she spoke not one word, so that Ywain marvelled, and was some deal discomfited. Then he called her by her name, Enya, but thereto she shook her head, and continued saying no word. And he said to her, What do you in this place, and by what name shall I call you? And again she answered not, but she took 2 shepherd's crooks that stood behind the door of the hut, and one of them she kept, and one she gave into his hand, and so led him forth. And they came together to the sheepstead, and untied the wattled cots, and loosed the sheep, and together they went hillward in the cool of the morning. Now as they went together, Ywain looked about him, and he saw the fauns that were his friends, and they stood beside the valley road in a place whereto Ywain should come presently. And he called to them joyfully, and they heard him calling, so that he hoped they would have stayed for him. But when he was now within a pitch of them, he saw how they were suddenly gone away, for they ran swiftly from him towards their wildwood, and the reeds of the river hid them as they ran. Yet they went not with one mind or one fear, for one of them stayed in his running and returned, and Ywain had sight of him among the willows, peering with bright eyes, and he perceived that he was stealing fast upon them, and going from tree to tree, and when they were at the turning of the road, where they must leave the valley and go upon the hill, then the reeds rustled and crackled beside the road, and the fawn broke forth suddenly upon them, and he was that one that was the younger of the two. And he looked no more upon Ywain, but upon the shepherdess only, and he stooped down and took her hand, and nosed in it lovingly, as a deer will nose in the hand of her that feeds him. And Ywain spoke to him by his name, but thereat he started up, and went leaping after his fellow, and rustling like a wind among the reeds. Then the shepherdess led Ywain forth upon the hill, and behind them was the river, and before them was the little beechen grove. And they came to the grove, and sat within the shade of it, and looked over the valley, and the sheep went cropping the wild thyme and the milkwort, and clanking pleasantly with their bells. And the shepherdess looked downward upon Ywain, for he lay before her at her feet. And he turned and looked upward into her eyes, and as he looked, the day went over him in a moment of time, between two beats of his heart, and he lacked speech of her no longer, for he dreamed under her silence as a man may dream under a starry night. Then she rose and led him again downward, and the sheep went down before them to the river, and fell to drinking greedily. And as they drank, the wind of evening came softly down the stream, and upon it came a sound of piping, and Ywain's heart ached to hear that piping, for it was of a sad and piercing sweetness. Then his feet began to move beneath him, and he left the sheep to their drinking, and went toward the music. And he came to a glassy pool among the rocks, and upon the rocks was the young fawn sitting, and playing on his pipes, and under his feet was the evening sky, shone clearly upon the water of the pool. And Ywain came near, for the music drew him strongly, and he stood and looked upon the pool, and he saw the sky therein, and he saw it not as sky, but as a great region of the sea, for the clouds upon it were like lands of earth, and they lay there after the fashion of bays and heads and islands. And there was a coast that lay fast by him, as it were beneath his very feet, and it ran to the right of him and to the left, and beyond it was the void space of the sea. And as he looked upon the coast he knew it well, for he stood by seeming upon the high steep of Paladore, and looked out over the Shepherdine sands. Then with the beauty of the place he fell to longing, and because of the music that he heard, his heart was restless, and he desired greatly to be seeking for the land wherefrom that music came. And in a moment it was there before him, beyond the void space of the sea, and the form of it was as the form of Paladore, with the city and the steep all fashioned out of cloud. But it lay lonely and far out, like an island of the west, and a light was upon it, more delectable than all the lights of sunset, so that it seemed to burn also in the eyes of him that saw it. And the light and the music increased together, and together they faded and ceased. And when they ceased, Ywain turned him aside to weep, for he perceived that he was homeless. But as he turned, he saw his lady beside him standing, and she spoke and called him by his name, as one that knew him afresh, and was no more bedumbed. And he cast himself into her arms and kissed her, for he knew that he had had sight of no earthly city, but of Aladore. Then he looked again upon the pool, if by fortune he might see that city again, and he saw but a ripple on the water, for with his hoof the fawn had dabbled it. Chapter 32. How Ywain lived as it had been in the Golden Age, and how he was still unsatisfied. Right so came the night, and they got them homeward, and Aithne went to her hut, where she had her living among the shepherds. But Ywain returned and rested with the fauns, and he slept not, but lay a great time waking, and longing for the morrow morn, whereby he hastened it not, but delayed it rather. And this is the folly of men, that they will look ever forward to that which they have not, and take no rest in that which they have. For Ywain had that day gathered to fill both his hands, namely, by seeing Aladore, and by taking of his lady in arms. And in a long life there will come but few such days, so that it were wisdom to cherish them in memory. But Ywain remembered scantly that which was past and gathered, for his mind was all on the kisses that were to come, and folly it was past gainsaying, but of such folly is the life of man. So he lay longing, and arose in hope, and continued many days after the same gait. And his desire fled still before him, and he followed and thought not on the way of his going. For to him one day was like another, and one night was like another, and he counted them no more than a child will count the beads upon a string. But Aithne counted them, and laid them by, and when she counted them, she trembled, for she also would have him gone on pilgrimage, seeing that so only might she meet with her love in Aladore. But many times she said within herself, "Not yet, poor lady me, for none knows what may fortune, and belike this is all that shall be mine." Now the manner of their days was after the manner of the golden days, for their meeting was in the freshness of the morning, when all things are made new, and they ate and drank together with few words, and between them was a bowl of milk, and over it they laughed one at another with their eyes. For about the bowl was a thread of scarlet wool, and Ywain knew well for what reason it was there. Yet would he ask many times for asking's sake, and Aithne said how it was there of great necessity, for she set it there to be a witch knot, to draw her love to her by shepherd's magic. Then many times he broke the thread and cast it on the ground, and always when he came again, the knot was freshly knotted upon the bowl. So out of nothing they made much, after the old fashion. Then with their sheep they took the road, and came thence upon the upland pastures. And while the day was yet cool, they too went wandering alone, and marvelling at all the diverse flowers upon the hills. But when the sun was overhead, and the air began to tremble upon the rocks, then beneath a little cliff they found a spring of water flowing out continually, and sparkling like crystal above the pebbles. And thereby grew tall fir trees, and white poplars, and cypresses and planes. And on the branches the cicalas were chirruping, all sunburnt, and the ringdoves were moaning one to another of love. And below them were many flowers of fragrance, such as fill the meadows in the heyday of the year before it wanes. And all the land smelt sweetly of summer, and the wild bees went booming about the water springs. And thither came Ywain to his shepherding, and he forgot the world as though it had never been, for he remembered neither land nor gold, nor his old fame among men, but he sat with his love beneath a rock, and held her in his arms, and they murmured one to another, and watched their sheep feeding among the thyme. And when it drew towards evening, they came downward from the hill, and listened to hear the young fawn's music, for among the fawns there is not one that dare pipe at noon, but at evening they will pipe without fear. And when there was a sound of music, then Ywain came always to the glassy pool, hoping that he might have sight of Aladore. And when the pool was still, he saw it, for the piping of the fawn was of a strong magic, beyond all understanding of him that made it, as happens many times to them that make music. But Ywain had of that magic more pain than joy, for the vision which he saw thereby was of no substantial city, but of an image made in water, and to find that city in truth his heart was restless with desire, for he knew that except he came there, he might have neither fullness of love, neither abiding. Chapter 33. Of the madness of the fawns, and how Ywain forsook them suddenly, and his lady with him. Moreover, when midsummer was now come, Ywain began to misdoubt him of the fauns, for from gentle they were become fierce, and when he saw their eyes he saw them changed as a sky that is hot with thunder. Also they departed from him continually, both by night and by day, and he saw how they went wandering alone and secretly. And when they went forth, they went as it were, ravening like beasts. And when they came again, they came weary and shamed before him, as with the shame of men, for in their nature they were divided between two kinds. Then upon a night it fortuned to Ywain that his sleep was broken because of the moonlight that crept upon him, and at the last he awoke utterly, and in the moonlight he saw the young faun beside him sleeping, but the old one he saw not, for he was plainly slunk away, and Ywain took but little heed of him, as at this time, for his own head was weary, and he had yet no comfort of the night. So he turned him and lay still again, and thought to sleep. But as he lay, there came a sound from far off, like the cry of one that shrieks suddenly in fear. And with that sound, Ywain also was affrighted, and his heart stood still, and he held his breath to listen. And there was silence for a space, and he said, "It is an evil dream, for it is long since that cry was in my ears." And therewith the cry came again, louder than before, and Ywain perceived that the voice was the voice of a woman. And he started up and leaned upon his hand, and the sweat pricked him suddenly among the roots of his hair. And the young faun also started up out of sleep, and stood before Ywain listening. And Ywain saw his eyes that glittered under the moon, and his mouth that grinned and trembled as a dog's mouth grins before he bites. Then the crying came again the third time, and continued more and more, and it was by seeming nearer, as of one running and crying upon the hillside. And Ywain thought to know the place, and he leapt upon his feet to go thither. But when he would have gone he could not, for the young faun cast his arms about Ywain's knees, and held him fast. And Ywain looked down upon him, and was astonished, for aforetime he had seen him as a thing young and tameable, and of a nature softer than the nature of men. But now he saw the teeth of him, and heard the growling, and therewith a red hatred came upon Ywain, and his heart swelled up to bursting, and he fell upon the faun and beat him with fists upon the head. But the faun loosed him not for all that, nor ceased not from his mirth, and they two rolled upon the ground and fought together, the one grinning always, and the other sobbing, for Ywain wept fiercely with rage to be so hindered. Then at the last he caught the faun and choked him, and so cast him grovelling, and he escaped out of the wildwood and began to climb upon the hill. And now that he was escaped, he knew no longer whither he should go, for there was no more sound of shrieking, but a great silence of moonlight and solitude. And he went to and fro upon the hillside, and found there no living thing. And at the last the sky began to lighten towards dawn, and his strength left him, so that he laid him down, and slept he knew not where. And when he awoke the sun was high, and he looked down the hill, and saw Aithne coming towards him, and she was leading forth her sheep, for it was time. As she came he saw her loveliness, while she was yet far from him, for her going was both proud and womanly, and she showed forth in it the fashion of her heart. And when he saw that, he thought on pain and terror, and he had great pity upon all women, and he went quickly to meet her and said, "What have we here to do? For we should be gone long since." But she looked at him and saw how he was already weary, even in the first hour of the day, and how he was troubled beyond measure, even in her presence that loved him. Also she saw how he was soiled and somewhat bebled upon the hands. And she touched his hand with her hand, and asked him of his hurt, and for what cause he would be gone. And he told her no truth, for he would not tell her of his pity. But he spoke of himself only, and he said, "I am afraid, for I go in peril of my life by reason of the fauns." Then she said, Dear heart, be not afraid, for I know the fauns, that they will be cruel at their hours, and I have a spell to tame them, for they are but beasts. Yea, said he, they are my brethren of the half-blood, and now I beseech you that you lay down your crook, and leave your sheep to feed as may befall them, and let us be gone by what way you will. And she delayed, and asked him, Whither? And he said, I know not whither, but this I know, that I have fought with my kin, and I have dwelt among them long enough. Then Aithne sighed, and she turned her about and looked upon the valley, and the sun lay broad upon it, and the morning shadows, and the river ran bright among the willows below, and in the rocky pools above. And she sighed again, and then she said, It is nothing, beloved, for we have been long together, and we have that which hath been, and that which shall be. But as men say, a joy that ends is never long enough. So now I sigh, because I must bid this place farewell. And I knew always that we must some day be gone from it, and I waited only for your will. This is my will, said Ywain, and he cast her crook upon the ground, to be a token to them that should find it lying. Then he took her by the hand, and they looked again upon the valley, and they kissed for comfort and for memory, and turned them and went together across the hills. End of Part 11. Part 12 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 34 to 36. Chapter 34. How Ywain and Aithne went flying between sun and moon. Then they went hastily until it was past noon, and Ywain would not that they should stint, till at last they wearied both and lacked strength for lack of meat. And they espied a shepherd's hut, all lonely among the hills, and it stood fast by a thicket. And they knew not whose it might be, for it was far off from the valley of their dwelling. So they came thither and found it empty, for the shepherds were abroad with their flock. Then they went within the hut, and shut to the door, and thought to rest them a while. But Ywain sat him down beside the window, and hid himself that he might keep watch, for he doubted that they were not yet wholly escaped. And when he had watched for the space of half an hour, he saw how that there was something stirring in the border of the thicket, and presently came forth the young fawn, going warily upon his hands and upon his shanks. And he cast about him on this side and on that, nosing the earth as a hound upon the trail, and he began to creep toward the hut, and Ywain moved not but laid hold upon his staff. But in the same moment he looked beyond the fawn, and saw two shepherds which came coasting the thicket, and he heard their dogs behind them barking and driving in the sheep. And the fawn also heard them, and was discomfited, for his wits had been all upon the trail, and he was well nigh trapped. And the shepherds saw him, and cried out upon him, and made to beat him with their crooks. But he ran with great leaps, and passed before them, and was gone into the thicket. Then Ywain went out to meet the shepherds, and to question them, for he perceived that they were come home from pasture before their time. And they said that they had great need to come, for that there was a gathering of fauns throughout all the country, and it was the time of their madness wherein they would be fell and beastly. Then Ywain told his tale also, and they counselled him earnestly to go further, for they understood how that he was hated of the fauns, and belike against him was their gathering, and against none other. So Ywain brought his lady forth in spite of weariness, and the shepherds gave them such meat as they had, and sent them away. Then Ywain began to be afeard, as he had never been afeard in all his days, for he saw how his lady was fallen lame with the roughness of the hills. And this that was before him was no proper warfare, wherein a man may die reasonably, but a desperate and unclean fortune, to be overtaken by beasts in darkness. And on every wind he heard voices, and behind every tree he saw the shadow of his enemies, so that he went continually as through an ambush, forlorn of hope. But Aithne spoke always with good cheer, and made light of fauns as one that had a spell to subdue all creatures at her will. And almost Ywain believed her, for for she was steadfast beyond all bravery of feigning. Then at last the sun began to fall more swiftly to his setting, and a great perplexity came upon Ywain, for he supposed that in the darkness would be the end of all. But he knew not how, nor in what point of time, and he had a longing to say somewhat to Aithne, yet for shame he could not say it, lest by chance after despair there should come deliverance. And therein his heart betrayed him not, for his fortune was better than his fear. Thus they continued going forward and speaking as in hope, and though they spoke deceivingly each to other, yet their spirits were in peace together. And as they went, they looked upon the sky westward, and there was a little span between the sun and the sky border, and by that span they saw their life and measured it. And the sky was clear above and without cloud, but the sun was greatening below in a mist of rose, and against the mist was a black jot, as it were a black crow homing towards nightfall. And when it came nearer, they saw how it was in bigness greater than a crow, and in colour diverse, for the light went through it and yellowed it, and it flew more swiftly than a bird. Also it came with a sound of humming like a great bee, and the nearer the louder, till the air was shaken with the humming of it, and the blood quickened in them that heard it. And Ywain and Aithne stood still to look upon it, and they saw that it was by seeming a man which flew with wings. And he came over to them where they stood, and went about them in a circle like a buzzard, wheeling lightly and looking down upon them. Then Ywain made a sign requiring succour of him, and he took Aithne into his arms and made to shelter her, and with his staff he swung great strokes about him, as it were against a host of enemies. And his sign was well understanded of him that was flying, for he dropped swiftly down upon the earth, and he put off his wings and came running where Ywain was and Aithne. And they saw how that he was a man like unto themselves, but tall and strong and comely out of measure, and at a word he perceived their peril and the evil malice of the fauns. Then hastily he did on his wings, and he took a thong, and when he had bound Ywain and Aithne with the thong, he made them fast beneath his pinions, and so mounted lightly upon the air. And Ywain and Aithne looked down and marvelled and held their breath, for the whole earth fell from them suddenly, and for a moment they had sight of fauns running together like ants beneath them, and then they saw the fauns also fall from them and become as dust. And the sun set, and the moon rose, and they went flying swiftly between the sun and the moon. Chapter 35. Of the city of Daedala, and how an old dame therein despaired of it. So they went swiftly, and spoke no word, being astonished unto dumbness, for their life was changed suddenly, and they were in no place of the world. But he that bore them held his course, and he flew eastward by the space of an hour. Then they were aware how he sloped downwards in his flight, and they looked and saw beneath them a great city on the border of the sea, and in no long time they came lightly down and took land before a gate that was there. Then they three entered afoot into the city, and they came quickly to a good house, and were received therein. Now the house was the house of an old and noble dame, by name Ywain, and she was the mother of Hyperenor, which had borne Ywain and Aithne upon his wings. And them she greeted courteously, and received them to be her guests, while it should please them. But to her son she spoke after another sort, for in one and the same breath she dealt him sweet words and bitter, giving thanks to all the gods for his homecoming, and also bidding him be gone, where she might never be troubled with him more. And after this manner she continued all supper time, and she would have Aithne to know how she was the most miserable of all women living. For I was born, she said, in a city far off from this, and in a land of other men and other customs, and I came hither blindfold in my youth, and the veil wherewith I was blinded was the veil of marriage, as it fortunes to the most of us. For of this city I knew nothing, but I supposed it to be an ancient city, and a pious with gods and customs like our own. and I found it given over to a madness of inheritance, and by special wrath of heaven accursed and punished. For this is the city of Daedala, where is the tomb of Daedalus, whom they call the father of inventions. And though his bones be perished, yet they keep here his impiety, and do after it. And their madness is beyond belief, for there is nothing that they will do by way of nature, if by any means they can devise to do it otherwise, as by mechanisms of iron or brass. And at my first coming they were assotted upon chariots of fire, and afterwards upon 100 other devices, full of noise and dangerous exceedingly. And now they sin with the very sin of Daedalus, for when he had found out many inventions, he found out this also, to fly above the earth with wings, a thing plainly hateful to the gods, for if it had been their will, they would have made men like to birds in the beginning. But their will was not so, and they have sent upon this city the curse of Daedalus. For as the god took his son from him, and cast him dead upon the sea, so now it is with us, and heavier 100-fold. Then the old dame wept bitterly, that it was pity to see, and her son ran to her and knelt beside her, and handled her lovingly. And when he had some deal comforted her, then he spoke merrily, and said how it was shame to lay so much on gods, and to make them unreasonable, and so bring them into judgment. And it may be, he said, that it is we and none other that are the gods, for certainly we are greater than our fathers, and there shall yet be greater that shall come after us. But his mother rebuked him and said, I will not hear such words, for your fathers kept due observance and lived long, and you of this generation do reverence to none, but you fly outrageously in the face of heaven, and your youth is cast down upon the earth as upon a dust heap. And to what profit? For you die like the flowers and leave no name behind you. And Hyperenor said, So be it, but our fruit shall follow us, for it may be that our sons shall fly and not fall. But Ywain wept again and said, You are great givers, for you tear your mother's hearts to feed your children. Then Enya went to her to comfort her, for she was sorry in her heart for that old dame, and she saw how she had no other son but this one only, and him she looked daily to lose. And Ywain also had pity on her, for there is no man that can bear to look upon a woman weeping. But he was divided in mind, and in part he was pitiful, as need was, but in greater part he took side with Hyperenor, and upheld him to have the right of it, for he saw how the young man was a great knight and strong and passing comely. And though his words were some deal big, yet his voice was slow and courteous, as the voice of one that would make good. Also in his doctrine Ywain upheld him, for in all wars there will be some that die, and they die gladly to subdue a kingdom, though for themselves they see it not nor enter into it. But most he loved him as one that would dare and do, and of his daring and his doing he would willingly hear more, for it seemed to him a great and marvellous thing that men should fly, that so they might come into all places of the earth, yea, and perchance into some that are beyond. Chapter 36. Of a promise that was made to Ywain, and how he took wings to seek for Aladore. Then, after supper, the old dame went out, and Enya with her, and Ywain was left there with Hyperenor, and they two sat a long time talking together. As they talked, they drank their wine, by cup and by cup, and they sat beside a window, and the window was open wide, looking upon the city and upon the lights thereof. And the night over them was blue and spangled with bright stars, and Ywain perceived how that Hyperenor was no longer strange to him, but near and kind as out of old friendship. And he spoke with him concerning many matters, and was accorded with him continually. Then at the last he spoke of Aladore, and he told him how that he must of necessity come there to be wedded with his lady, and how he had sight of that land as it were of a cloud in heaven, yet he could by no manner of means attain to find it. And Hyperenor received his saying readily, and began to make him large promises, for he was such an one that in his book was no word for things impossible. And he said how he would give Ywain wings, and learn him quickly how he should use them, so that in one day he might well come to fly with all ease, if he had but good courage and continuance of fortune. And as for Aladore, he had no knowledge thereof, but to find it he took to be no hard matter. For if such place there be, he said, be sure that flying will bring us to it, save it be at the sea bottom. And in that case he told Ywain how that he had yet another mechanism to do his purpose, so that by wing or by water Ywain should certainly come thither. Then when Ywain heard those words he was fain to believe them, and he began to feel his wings uplifting him, and he doubted not of Hyperenor, but he thought to know more of his mind concerning Aladore. Therefore he asked him toward what quarter of the earth they should begin their seeking, and Hyperenor answered, toward no quarter, for that the land was plainly no place of earth, but a floating isle after the kind of the isles which float upon the sea, and belike it would be found in the region of the stars. And Ywain marvelled at his knowledge, and took comfort of it, for he also believed that it was no earthly city which he sought, but what else it might be he knew not, until it was showed him reasonably. So he heard Hyperenor and was content, and looked upward to the stars, and he beheld their aspect, such as with his eyes he never yet beheld it, for he knew them of old both by stars and by constellations. But now first he saw their images in heaven, and behind every constellation was an image, like a great shadow, decked with stars, and the shadows went about the high dome like servants of the gods, going silently in their appointed order. And Ywain knew no longer where he might be, for he saw no more the lights of the city, nor heard the voice of Hyperenor that talked beside him. Also it seemed to him that time was fallen dead, so that the world was void and still, as a glass is void when all the sands are run down upon the heap. And he awoke as from long dreaming, but he perceived that Hyperenor knew not how he had been from him all that space. So within a while they betook them to their rest. Then on the morrow they rose up early, and came to a meadow ground which lay before the gate of the city. And Hyperenor gave Ywain wings according to his promise, and showed him all his own skill therewith. And Ywain received his teaching quickly, and brought it to good market, so that in no long time he went which way he would. And he wearied not, nor failed of strength, but his wings upbore him lightly without labour, for they were so devised. And when it was evening he thought to prove his adventure, for he was not willing to return into the house to Aithne until he should have somewhat to tell her. And when the sun was now going down into the sea, Ywain did on his wings again, and scanned all the regions of the sky, and there was no cloud near the sun, but over against his setting there was only one cloud, made golden by the light of evening, and under the cloud was the moon rising, and she came up out of the mountains of the east, and went climbing towards the cloud. Then Ywain called to Hyperenor, and together they leapt into the air. Then at the first they went wheeling about and about to gain the height of the sky, and the dusk began to fall softly round them, and Ywain looked down in his wheeling, and there was the city of Daedala very far beneath him, and it smallened and darkened continually, so that save for the moonlight upon the towers he had soon seen it no more. But for a time he saw it still, lying cold and white by the border of the sea. Then he looked up and saw the stars, and above him Hyperenor flying beneath the starry roof. And Ywain followed him, and they left their wheeling and flew straight toward the cloud above the moon. And the moon rose up to meet them, and the light of her came cold upon their faces, and they strained in their flight to hold their way above her, so that they flew faster and faster into the hollow of the night. And as they went, the coldness of the void entered into Ywain's blood, and he felt no more neither hope nor fellowship, and his love lay frozen within him, as the root of a flower lies frozen in winter. But his thought was busier than aforetime, and his desire was to know all things which might be known. And he looked down again toward the earth, and saw it as a thing without life or meaning, for in bigness it was lesser than his hand, and it fell beneath him like a stone that is hurtled from a cliff. And he said within himself, "What is that to me? For it is but one amongst many." And he looked up again to Hyperenor that he might follow him further. But when he looked, he saw him not, nor the cloud neither, and in a moment his thought was dazed within him, and went staggering like a man struck suddenly upon his eyes. For on every side the stars were changed about him, and they kept no more the order of their constellations, but they were as a crowd rushing upon him, countless and disorderly. Then he looked again upon the moon, and saw her as it were hard by him, and he was yet more in dread, for she was no living land, but a bare plain and cold, and upon the plain were hills like naked bones, and black pits like the pits of dead men's eyes. And in the same instant he saw against the moonlight Hyperenor falling like a dead bird towards the earth. And in his fall he came by Ywain, and went fluttering past him, and Ywain leaned over and peered after him, and the coldness left him, and the blood came again swiftly from his heart. And he stooped his head and went whirling down the gulf, and the winds rushed up to meet him, and bore him whither they would, for his strength was as the strength of a leaf that falls at end of summer. End of Part 12. Part 13 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 37 to 39. Chapter 37. How Ywain came the second time to the hermit, and how he took counsel of him. Now Ywain fell swiftly earthward, and belike the time of his falling was no great space, but to him it seemed long beyond reckoning, for his wits were battered and edge-worn as a stone is worn by 100 years of rolling. And whiles he dropped headlong through the void, and whiles the wind came up beneath him and lifted him lightly, so that he rose and fell, as it were, upon great waves of the sea. But at the last he came hurtling down upon a forest, and among the trees of it his wings were caught and broken. Yet was Ywain not broken therewith, but he took the earth easily and recovered himself. Then he got to his feet and began to go through the forest, and it came to his mind that he was thrice lost, and not once only, for he was gone from his lady and from his friend, and he knew not where to seek them, nor in what place of the world he might himself be wandering. And for Enya, he prayed to see her again in no long time, for he knew how she could come and go by her own magic. That was her gift of fairy. But for Hyperenor he lamented without praying, for he supposed that he was gone beyond that. And for himself he raged against fate, for it seemed to him that his life had fallen suddenly from light to darkness, as a lamp that is thrown down, and though it be not broken, yet it cannot be kindled again, but cold it lies and blackened that was burning but a moment since. And when he perceived that, then he bit and beat against time, as a wild thing will bite against the bars of a cage. Howbeit he continued still upon his way, and suddenly he perceived that he was in no strange path, for he was going between tall pines, and beyond the pines was a stream that ran burbling, and a bank with great beeches upon it. And he went forward quickly, as one that well knows what he shall find. And as he thought, so it fortuned to him, for he came by sunrise to a bare lawn under a cliff, and in the face of the cliff was a door carven and a window or two, and it was the house of the hermit that was friend to him, and right glad he was to see that place again. And when he came there the sun was risen, and the hermit was coming forth out of his house in like manner as he had done aforetime, and in like manner he brought bread and broke it for the small fowls of the forest. And Ywain was amazed to behold his dealing, for there had come no change upon the man, nor upon the place, nor upon anything therein, but Ywain only was changed within himself, and made new by time and trouble. Then he stood still beneath a beech tree, and called with a quiet voice, and bade the hermit a good morning, and the hermit moved not, but answered him yet more quietly, and continued feeding his birds. So they two came together without ado or overmuch heartiness, but inwardly they were quickened both as with memory and friendship. And they went together to the stream, and when they had given bread to the fishes, then they did off their garments quickly, and took the pool as they had done aforetime, and they sported joyfully, and so came home to break their fast together. Now as they sat at table, Ywain looked out from the window, and he saw the sunlight upon the lawn, and he heard the murmur of the stream, for the sound of it came by upon a little wind of morning. And he bethought him how the times were changed, and all his mind unknown to the hermit who sat beside him. Then the hermit said to him, "We are strangely met again, but in a year this place is nowise changed, and I have gone but a little downward on the byway of my life. But you have journeyed far to the forward, and are come within sight of your desire." And Ywain was astonished and asked him, "How know you that which has befallen me? For it is a long tale, and I have not yet told a word of it." And the hermit answered, "I know it not, but there is little need of telling. For I set you forth on your way to Paladore, and therein you followed your desire. And without doubt there met you by the way a woman, for by every man's way there is a woman, and without doubt you learned of her that which all women teach. And for the rest, you have encountered this and that adventure, and though you have proved them well, yet have you failed of your achievement unto this present, for there is hope in your eyes, and no certainty, and you are here alone and wandering." Then Ywain opened his heart, and he told his story by part and by parcel, until he had told it all. And when he had ended his telling, the hermit was silent, and he sat there stilly, and moved no more than if he had been lost in sleep. And at the last Ywain said to him, "That which I have done, is it well done or ill?" Then the hermit stirred a little and sighed deeply, and so fell again to silence. But afterwards he spoke and said to Ywain, "Forgive me, for I was thinking of myself. Yet not of myself only, but of you and of many, for we are all banished men, and we seek for the road of our returning. And you do well on your part, for your serving and your seeking are one, and though you find not yet, neither do you turn aside to rest, for the time is not come wherein you must be content with memory and solitude." And Ywain looked upon him, and he saw that he spoke out of sorrow, for his eyes were like still water. But deep within them the spirit of the man was troubled, as the sand is troubled beneath the stillness of a spring. And Ywain longed greatly to comfort him, but found no words, for he would not question him of his sorrow. Then he thought to put him in mind of his wisdom that he had found by loneliness. But thereto the hermit answered yet more sadly, and said, "There are that choose loneliness, but upon me it came perforce. And for my wisdom it is one thing to you and another thing to me, for to you it is as a living voice to counsel the living, but to me it is as the stone upon a grave, which gives good words when there is none left to hear them." Then Ywain said to him, "What then, will you return and come with me?" The hermit smiled a little and answered him, "Not so, for I shall be none the nearer to the country of my abiding. But go you," he said, "and return to the city, and do your seeking among men, for your life is yet to find, and among men you must find it." Chapter 38. How Ywain returned again to Paladore for to dwell there, and how he spoke to appease the strife that was between the people. So on that day Ywain had converse with the hermit, and on the morrow early he departed from him. And he went from him by the former way, but he went not after the former manner, for at this time his journeying was by daylight and not by moonlight, and he had no aid of horses, but fared always upon his feet. Notwithstanding he made good speed, and came betimes to the place of the stepping stones, and it seemed to him a place right dreary and desert, where before had been his lady with him, and great fighting upon the bank. So he passed on quickly and came to Paladore, and he saw the city also as a dim and dreary city, for his heart was fordone with loneliness, and his thought dragged like a man that is footsore with going. Then he came to the gate and passed in, and immediately there came to meet him 2 men, and they ran towards him on this side and on that, and one of them was clad in scarlet and the other in black. And they too laid hold on him both together, and they spoke to him loudly, as it were, with one voice, so that he heard not of their saying 2 words in 20. But when their ardour was somewhat abated, then he heard them more plainly, and their tale was this, that the company of the Eagle and the company of the Tower were at odds together, and some of them were even now within the great hall of the city, speaking the one against the other, and like enough to go further with it. And as for them which took hold of Ywain, they had the office from their companies to wait within the gate, and if any should enter, to send him quickly to the place of meeting. And they offered Ywain badges of the Tower and of the Eagle, and were urgent with him each for his own, that Ywain might declare himself as of that company, for they knew him not, or else they had forgotten, or belike they thought to carry him away with words. And when he heard their clamouring, and knew not for what cause the striving might be, then at the first his spirit was sick within him, and he thought to break away from them. And he said to them, Let me go my way, for I have enough business of my own. And again he said, Let me go, for I am weary and would rest. But when he had spoken these words, he saw the men no longer, neither the red nor the black, but he saw beside him the hermit standing and looking into his face. Then the hermit took him by the hand, and began to lead him towards the marketplace, and as they went he spoke not to Ywain, but held him always by the hand, and it was as though his mind was poured into Ywain's mind, like wine that is poured from one cup into another. And Ywain knew whither he went, and he made no more resistance, for he said within himself, This is the life of Paladore, to strive by companies, and I know of which company I am. Then he thought again upon the eagles, and his blood leapt up to be with them, and he hastened in his going, and knew not that he hastened. And in that moment the hermit was gone from him, and he came alone into the marketplace. Now there was gathered in the place a crowd, exceeding great and turbulent, and they were plainly divided between the 2 companies. For they which favoured the Tower stood upon the steps of the great hall in a ground of vantage, and they which were of the Eagles stood in the streets below. And they were waiting until their men should come forth to them from within the hall. And as they waited, they gibbered and jibed, the one party against the other. But when they saw Ywain, they left that and shouted at him all together, for they remembered him and desired him each company for their own. And the Eagles desired him, because he had fought for them aforetime, and they of the Tower desired him, because he had fought against them and worsted them, so that between them Ywain thought to be divided piecemeal. But in that moment the doors of the great hall were opened, and they which were within began to come forth. And there came before them a crier with a bell, and he stood upon the topmost step, and rang his bell, and cried. And Ywain heard of his crying the last word only, and they of the Tower caught up that word, and shouted joyfully, He is banished! Then the Eagles shouted, He shall not be banished! And their shouting was the louder, and by some deal the fiercer. And they called to Ywain to help them, and they made way, and pushed him forward upon the steps. Then he went slowly up the steps, and he stood and looked upon the crowd, and as he stood, he cast about in his mind what he should say, for of the matter in dispute he knew but this word only, that one was in danger to be banished. So from that word he began his speaking, and he said first how that to banish any man was an evil custom, against kindness and against reason both, for if a man had done wrong, he should suffer there where he had done the wrong, seeing that it was his country notwithstanding. And secondly, he said how that in any case a man should suffer by law and not by hatred, for he may offend a whole company and yet be no lawbreaker, nor of evil intent. And thirdly, he said that to speak against customs is lawful, for a custom may be such as was good yesterday, but in no wise good today, nor for ever, and to end it is no murder. And all this he spoke, not angrily, but with a sad voice and a slow. and from fierce the crowd became gentle, and they murmured continually for pleasure as a cat will purr when she is stroked with the hand. For they of Paladore love best to see fighting, but after that they love to hear speaking, and he that hath power of wind may raise their anger at his own will, and lay it again like the waters of the sea. So they were stilled and put in peace together, as for this time, and they left the marketplace, and departed each to his own business. But they of the tower forswore not their intent, for they held by their custom, and hated Ywain, but they perceived well that they must abide their time. Chapter 39. How Ywain beheld a game of children, and heard their singing. Now Ywain stood still to see the crowd departing, and of them which came near to him, there were some which greeted him, and some which looked sullenly upon him. And as he saw them, he thought upon the fashion of this world, wherein all men are homeless. For though a man dwell where he will, and see good days, yet everywhere he will be at strife with some, and belike with many. Then he thought to go to his own house, and he came there, and entered into it. But when he was therein, he looked about him doubtfully, for he could not tell if it should still be his own, or given to another. So he stayed not there, but went forth again he knew not whither, for his wits wandered otherwhere, but his feet lightly found out the ways of his desire. And the time was the time of sunset, and there went a great thunder over the city, and a sudden rain. And when the rain ceased, there was a light in the air, and a marvellous clearness, and it seemed to Ywain as though that clearness was in his eyes also, and in his mind, and in his heart, and he went wandering in joy. So he came to a gate of the city, and marked it not, but passed through it, and beyond the gate he saw suddenly the high steep before him, grey and green, and upon it was a company of children, singing and making merry, for they had run forth after the ceasing of the rain. And there beyond them was the sea, shining like grey steel, and the trees were dark against it, and the sky was heavy above with bands of purple, but between the bands the colour of it was pale and cool, and like to the colour of green apples. Then Ywain stood still to look upon the sea and the sky, and the children came round about him and looked also, and as they stood looking, there passed a cloud over the Shepherdine sands, and the cloud was drawn down upon the white water, and it was the last cloud of the storm going west before the wind, and the passing away of it was like the drawing of a curtain, for immediately there was light instead of darkness upon the Shepherdine sands, and upon all the region that was beyond. And in the light there was a land, as it were far off, but exceeding clear, and upon the land was a steep and a city, and by seeming it was no strange city, for it was built and bulwarked after the very fashion of Paladore. Notwithstanding it was strange enough, for it was small and bright as a city that is painted in a book, and the light wherewith it shone was a light of dawn and not of sunset. And as Ywain looked upon the city, it seemed to him that the light was upon his own eyes also, and upon his mind and upon his heart, and he named the land aloud and called it Aladore. And the children that were beside him heard the word that he spoke, and immediately they broke into shouting after the manner of children, and ran busily from one to another among themselves. And Ywain perceived that they would play at a game together, and by seeming the game was called the game of Aladore. And at the first he marvelled, but afterwards he marvelled no more, for he remembered how that it was forbidden to speak that name in all the city, and how that the desire of children is ever to do and to say that which is forbidden to them. Then he went a little aside, and stood within the gateway, and looked forth to see the playing of that pastime. And he saw how the children departed them into two bands, which stood a line the one over against the other. And their pastime was the singing of a song, and they sang it, as it were, an antiphony, verse answering to verse, and they kept the time full orderly with their hands and with their feet, and the verses of the song were in number 6, and the words of it were these: To Aladore, who goes the pilgrim way? Who goes with us to Aladore before the dawn of day? Oh, if we go the pilgrim way, tell us true. How do they make their pilgrimage that walk the way with you? Oh, you must make your pilgrimage by noonday and by night, by 7 years of the hard road and an hour of starry light. Oh, if we go by the hard road, tell us true. What shall they find in Aladore that walk the way with you? You shall find dreams in Aladore, all that ever were known, and you shall dream in Aladore the dreams that were your own. Oh then, to Aladore we'll go the pilgrim way, to Aladore, before the dawn of day. Now these were all the verses which the children sang, but when they had sung them all, they sang the last verse again and yet again. And as they sang they turned them about, and they went by two and by two along the edge of the green steep, after the manner of lovers or of friends, which go together on pilgrimage. And when Ywain saw that, his heart burned his eyes, for even in the playing of the children he beheld an image of his own life. But they went from him quickly, for they continued still in their singing and their marching, and they passed by a tower that was in the wall, and Ywain saw them no more. But he heard their singing far off when they were long gone from him, and at the last he knew not in truth whether he heard it or heard it not, but only he knew that the sound of it was still abiding with him. End of Part 13. Part 14 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 40 to 42. Chapter 40. How Ywain came to Aladore. Then Ywain went forth again from the gateway, and he came to the edge of the high steep, to the place wherein the children had their pastime, and there under the trees he began to go to and fro, for he was restless by reason of the song that was yet in his ears. And as he went to and fro, the song continued with him, and it worked as it were an enchantment in his blood, for he kept looking upon Aladore that lay there under the sky border beyond the Shepherdine sands. And he saw it in a light that was no light of earth, and he knew no longer where he might be, but the world was lost and vanished from him, and his feet ceased from going, and he stood at gaze, looking only upon that land of his desire. Now at the first it was far off from him, but afterwards he beheld it near and clear past telling, for it seemed to him that power came upon him whereby he had a vision of things not to be seen with eyes. And for the land he saw that it was in all ways like to the land whereon he stood, and in like shape it lay beside the sea margent, and in like manner it rose up in a high steep, green and grey, and set with tall trees and shadowy. And for the city, that also was of no strange semblance, for it was in fashion the very image and counterpart of Paladore, and it was compassed with like walls and towers, and with like gardens and streets enriched and diapered. But by imagination Ywain beheld the place otherwise, for in his vision he perceived it as a city of peace, and one that knew neither strife nor evil custom, nor men of wood, nor men of wildfire, but only young lovers and old friends, and folk of free and gentle dealing. And besides these there were none other, save only fays and phantoms, and Ywain knew that it was in all things such a city, as seeing it he would have loved it in his youth. And his life days seemed to him but wasted, until he should enter and dwell therein. And therewith his spirit rose within him, and cried after that land with utter longing, for his memory and his hope were become one, and he knew not how to endure them. Then he started suddenly out of his vision, and went down the high steep like a rolling stone, and he came quickly with great bounds to the margent of the sea. And when he came there, he was aware of a little ship that lay upon the water, and it was made fast to the shore with a black rope and a white, and in it was a mast and a sail, and the sail was party black and white. And Ywain stayed not there, but leapt aboard and hoised up the sail, and he took the hermit's knife from his breast, and cut through the ropes, both the black and the white, for they were knotted strongly upon a ring of iron. Then he took the tiller into his hand, and the ship began to go swiftly from the shore. And he looked towards Aladore, and saw it fair before him, but how he should come there he knew not, for he must come first into that white and tumbling water of the Shepherdine sands. Right so he came flying amidst the sands, and entered into the quick of them, and the ship staggered and went suddenly from under him, and he fell down and down to the bottom of the sea, and he fell flatling, and sprang up again and leapt upon his feet. And as he looked upward and beheld the sea as it were above his head, all white and seething, and he perceived how it was in truth no sea, but mist, and belike it was a mist of faery, for it rolled and swirled above him in all semblance like to the sea, but there was in it neither death nor darkness. Then he went forward under the mist, and as he went it broke and was made thin before him, and he saw green grass beneath his feet, and over against him a mount of grey and green. And he knew that he was come unto the high steep of Aladore, and he saw it with no amazement, but with gladness only, for it was with him as with a man that has been long voyaging, and is returning at last into his own country. And he loved the land, and greeted it in his heart, and he found the path and climbed upon it, and came quickly to the topmost of the steep. And as he went climbing, he heard again the song that before was in his ears, and at the first he knew not whether he heard it within him or without. Then he saw above him the walls of the city, and the gates therein, and before the gate were children playing, and the children were the same children, and their pastime was the same pastime, for they stood a line in 2 lines, and sang together after the former fashion. And the words of their songs were these: You shall find dreams in Aladore, all that ever were known, and you shall dream in Aladore the dreams that were your own. Then, when he heard those words, he assented thereto, and he laughed in his heart, and so passed on. For they seemed to him nothing new, but he heard them as it were out of childhood and sweet memory. And he entered by the gateway, and came singing into the city. And the streets of it were cool and shining like pale gold, for they were all agleam with a light mist of sunrise. Chapter 41. How Ywain entered into the Rhymer's heritage, and how he found his lady therein. Now as Ywain went into the city, he went joyfully, for his heart was uplifted, and his thoughts were like high white clouds in a blue sky of summer. And most of all, he joyed to see the beauty of the place, for the form of it was the form of Paladore, but the beauty was mingled of likeness and unlikeness. And wherever he looked, there he saw that which he remembered, and there also he saw that which he remembered not, so that his joy was both old and new. And when he had gone but a score of paces into the city, he came to the court that lay before the great guard, and in the entrance of it he stayed. And there passed by him 2 or 3 which went not in, and he asked them whose was the castle, for he perceived that there was a change upon it. And they answered him that it was no castle, but the Rhymer's hall, for that by the Rhymer it was long since founded and upbuilt. And when they had so answered, they vanished from him suddenly, and were gone as though they had never been. Then he was astonished, and pondered a little, looking within the court. And in the court he saw not the halberdiers and men a horseback, which had been there aforetime. But upon the steps of the castle he saw a 5 or 6 minstrels with their lutes, and anon they sang, and anon they talked together, and by seeming their talk was all only upon their lutes and upon their singing. Then Ywain came to them and greeted them, and said, How long is this become a place of singing? And one of them answered him courteously and said, Fair lord, by your will we sing, and by your will we are silent. seeing that we are but the servants of your dream." And even as Ywain heard those words, the minstrels vanished, and there was nothing of them left in that place, save a little sound of lute strings that lingered waywardly. So Ywain entered into the Rhymer's Hall, and within door he found the porter, and the man sat there reading upon a book. And Ywain asked him, "What read you?" And immediately the porter vanished without answer given, and there was naught seen of him but his chair, and upon the chair was the book whereon he had been reading. Then Ywain came near and took up the book, and looked within it, and it was a wide book, painted delicately with great letters and with pictures, and the picture that was open before him was the picture of two lovers by a garden door. And the lady stood beside the door and leaned upon it with her hand to open it, but the lover came to her in habit of a pilgrim, and his hat was broad above his face and shadowed it. And Ywain's heart quickened as he looked, for the lady was his own lady, and she stood there as living as the leaves in spring. Then he laid the book upon the chair and left it lying, and he went through the Rhymer's Hall from end to end, and through all the courts of it and out beyond. And he came by a pleached alley to a close, and looked across the close, and upon the far side of it was a wall of stone, and in the wall was a carven doorway, and a door of wood, and there before the doorway stood Aithne in the morning gold. And she laid her hand against the door, and looked a little downward, as one that is waiting and musing. And when Ywain came to her, she spoke no word, but she turned away and led him through the doorway, and the door fell back and closed behind them, and it closed full slowly, but at the last there was a small noise of clanking, and the bar went home into the notch. And that noise was sweet in Ywain's ears, for it seemed to shut the world away, and he went to his lady as one that comes to his own land after long captivity. And little they spoke in words, but they looked each at each other, and his eyes were to her like two bright spears levelled in battle, and her eyes were to him like a valley at evening when the smoke goes up into the twilight. Then at the last he said to her, "What then is this place?" And she said, "It was the Rhymer's heritage, and now it is mine, and that which is mine is yours, for you have found it out and taken it. And belike it was yours from the beginning, for it is you that have made it anew, and you are the master of your dream." And as she spoke those words, a fear came suddenly upon him, lest she should also vanish and be gone from him. And he would have cried aloud of his fear, but she laid her hand upon his mouth and laughed, and stayed him from uttering. And she said, "I know your thought, and vain it is, for your dream and mine are one and not two, as they were aforetime. But each in other we have our home and our abiding." Chapter 42. How Ywain and Aithne were given each to other, and how they were wedded by the freedom of Aladore. Then Ywain stood still and mused, looking down upon the grass about his feet, and he mused upon his pilgrimage, whereby he had at last come hither. And Aithne asked him of his musing, and he answered her not, but he said, "Tell me, O my beloved, when shall be the end of this my pilgrimage?" And she answered, "It is ended, for the shrine is found, and the lamp of the world is lit afresh." But he asked her again, "By what token shall I have certainty of this?" And she said, "By a flame and by a gift, for by those tokens is love confirmed of all lovers, both of old and forever." Then his blood beat, and his throat trembled, and he said, "Yea, beloved, but it may yet be far to the hour of giving." And she also trembled, and said, "The hour of giving is the hour of starlight, and between the sun setting and moon rising, it will be here." Then Ywain looked again upon the ground, and he saw beside his feet the long morning shadows, and he said, "It is far, O my beloved." And she said, "Nay, but have I not told you that all things here are yours, for that you only are the master of the dream?" Then with her hand she pointed to the shadows upon the grass, and they were two shadows that were as one, and they lay upon a wide and open space. And Ywain looked again upon them and was amazed, for the shadows drew in apace, and they went round him as the finger goes upon the dial, save that they went 40 times more quickly. And he asked of his lady, What mean these shadows? For they are gone from the west into the east. And she answered him softly, O my lord, see you not that you are master even of the sun in heaven? And she looked stilly into his eyes, and a little wind of evening blew cool upon him. Then she took him by the hand and led him within the house, and she brought him to an upper room and to a window therein which looked upon the city. And the window was wide open, and without it was a gallery of stone. And Ywain held his lady's hand and went forward upon the gallery. Then he looked down and saw beneath him the courtyard full of folk, and the place was filled with the thronging of them, and the street beyond the gates was filled also. And at first the folk were silent and shadowy, and the twilight gathered thick upon them. And Ywain looked hard among them, peering to see if by their faces he might know them. And by one and by two he knew them, and there were by seeming in that place the faces of all men and women that he had known in all his life days. Then pity came upon him in a moment, and great pain, for he saw them as folk lost and gone from him, and he would have had them to be partakers in his joy. And in that moment came a light of sunset into the sky, and it glowed upon the faces of them that were before him. And they cried all together, and called him by his name, giving him friendship and honour. And Ywain shut to his eyes, for there was that which burned them hotly, and when he looked forth again, there was neither face nor form of any man, but only a sound as of folk departing. Then Ywain said to Aithne, Are there not also some within doors in this place, that I may do them courtesy? And she answered, They too are of the bordure of your dream. So she brought him within, and they went towards the great hall, and there went with them lights and trumpets. And when they came to the hall, they found there a great company of knights sitting at a feast together, and the knights were in number 100. And they were all they which in their time had sought the Lady Aithne and her love, and their feasting was full sombre and courteous. And when they saw Ywain and Aithne, they rose up and did them reverence, and they gathered about them and spoke many things of honour and of farewell. Then Ywain gave them thanks with the like honour, and immediately they faded from before him, and with them the lights also faded and fell to darkness. And in the hall was none left with Ywain and Aithne, save one child only, and the child was nowise strange to them, for it was he which had been the beginner of their pilgrimage. And in his hand was a torch burning, and he bore it up before them, and about them the shadows went dancing upon the walls and upon the roof. And he went down the hall, and they too followed after him with hand in hand, and so he brought them to the chamber where they should be wed. And when they were come, there he turned his torch downwards to quench it upon the floor, and the flame of it vanished, and the child therewith, and the place was lit by starlight only. But in the chamber was also a little glowing as of embers, and Ywain saw there an altar of bronze, and it seemed to him right ancient, as a thing made in the time out of mind. And beside the altar was a platter of meal and a cup of red wine standing, and Aithne took the meal in her hand, and in like manner Ywain took the wine, and they two stood beside the altar on this side and on that, and sprinkled it with meal and wine. And there went up from it 2 bright flames of fire, a red and a white, and they spired up and were entwined together, so that they were 2 colours, but only one flame. Then Ywain looked upon his beloved and said, The flame is here truly, but where is the gift? And she also looked steadfastly upon him and answered him, The gift is here, but it is yours to show first the manner of the giving. And thereat he took her by the hand and said, Here in free marriage I give thee the body of me, my life with thy life, my blood with thy blood, my dust with thy dust, to be mingled and made one. Then with a low voice she said after him the same words, and he said again, Here also I give thee the heart of me, my love with thy love, my hope with thy hope, my sorrow with thy sorrow, to be mingled and made one. And those words also she spoke in like manner. Then he said the third time, Here also do I witness that I have given thee long since the spirit of me, to be thy friend and fellow to the end of pilgrimage. Yea, she said, and thereafter, and with thee and with all the spirits to be mingled and made one. Then she said again, as to herself only, Now I am wedded by the freedom of Aladore, and so is my promise fulfilled. And when she had said that, she fell suddenly to weeping. And she went to the window and leaned upon the sill, and Ywain came near, and he saw her tears falling bright under the starlight. And he was both sorry and afraid, and he took her in his arms, and asked her many times wherefore she wept. And she told him not. And at the last she said, That will I tell you, but not now, and I weep not for sorrow, but for remembrance. Then he solaced her with comfort of strength and of silence, and afterwards they went joyfully to their wedding and to their rest. And the moon rose on Aladore, and they saw her not, for they slept as it had been the sleep of childhood. End of part 14.